Hey, all you beautiful Ethicuties and the 40% of you who have still not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you think changing our workplace is going to change our world, I got a real treat for you today. I know I say that sometimes, but I swear I mean it this time. We have the one and only Allison Taylor. Let's get a massive emoji explosion, a massive round of applause for the one and only Allison Taylor. We're going to be talking about going beyond good and bad, building good faith ethics programs. So I'm going to run through some announcements really quick. We're, of course, giving away books, of course, giving away credits. You guys all know that already, so join the Ethicsverse. As I'm running through this, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. Connect with someone today because your network's your net worth. Neither are big enough. And you got to take advantage of this thing that we have that nobody else, none of your coworkers in other departments have what we have here in the Ethicsverse, this amazing ethics community. So connect with someone today and stop trying to reinvent the wheel. Nobody gets that etched on their tombstone. He was really good at reinventing the wheel. We are giving away 5 of Allison's book. 10. Let's do 10. Let's double it because I love Allison so much. We're going to double giving away Higher Ground. So this book has been on every bestseller list you can imagine, written about multiple times in the Financial Times. And, you know, almost 2 years later after the release, people are still kind of talking about it. So if you have not picked up Higher Ground, get active in the chat, win yourself a book today. And if you're in Nashville, or want to come to Nashville, haven't been in Nashville for a while, you should come middle of this month in a couple of weeks. I guess it's right around the corner, isn't it? 2 weeks from now, we are going to be at the Opal Conference, the Transforming Healthcare with Emerging Technologies Conference. I'm talking on a panel with the one and only Reed Blackman, who you should absolutely follow his Substack if you have not checked that out. You absolutely should check out his podcast, Ethical Machines, and his book as well. And we're going to be talking with Camille. We're going to be talking about all kinds of cool stuff, ethics at the edge. If you have not taken our Enneagram quiz, if you guys want, drop a 1 in the chat if you want us to do the Enneagram presentation on an Ethico University or on one of our Tuesday sessions. I'd love to share it with you. The Enneagram is amazing, changed my life, changed how I show up and, you know, what I'm kind of tuned into. So if you've not taken this Enneagram quiz, you absolutely should. Figure out what your type is and how you can really leverage that within your program and be a lot more effective. Part of being a lot more effective is us making better bets with our time, like I'm saying all the time, us focusing our efforts on the things that matter most. We have all these human beings, all these human sensors, as I call them, in our organization, who can really help us to crowdsource that risk intelligence. When we get better risk intelligence and our eyes can be directed towards the things that matter most, we can make better bets with our time. We can really de-risk our organization and add to the enterprise value and kind of shed this moniker, this caricature many of us still feel that we're wearing of being a cost center. Ethics and compliance is not a cost center in my mind. It is an enterprise value creator. So when you can really kind of take advantage of the employee life cycle and these different employee touch points, whether it's on onboarding, whether it's with stay interviews, whether it's with a speak up program that really addresses anti-retaliation, that's a great hack to get people engaged in this process. Ethics and compliance can't be done in a vacuum. It can't be done in an ivory tower. We need the engagement of the human beings in our organization to really do our job. And if you remember what the number one thing is that prevent people from speaking up, it is this fear of retaliation. So reinvigorating, you know, this might be a great time to change providers, but reinvigorating, whether you're staying where you're at, reinvigorating your anti-retaliation program and really addressing this concern, kind of pulling that objection forward can do a lot to open up the floodgates. And listen, we're all wired to like leave the world better. We're all wired to improve things. That's like in all of our DNA. And so you have all these human beings in your organization that you just have to kind of open up the floodgates a little bit, and you'll be surprised at the ideas, the questions, the reports, the violations that are happening inside your organization that you can, again, direct your efforts toward. So we have an employee engagement solution set with a number of our solutions that can really help you do that. For all my Ethicuties, you get 25% off if you book your demo by the end of the quarter. This has everything you need, of course, just like that famous insurance company, only pay for what you need. You, of course, don't have to buy all these things, but this is a picture of the types of outcomes you can get by leveraging these different pieces of the solution for your organization. So exit and stay interviews, the world's best hotline, not my words, check G2, disclosure reports, analytics that help you, have a better eye on the dashboard and how those things are moving, and an employee portal that makes it easy for folks to search on Google and figure out how to speak up, how to report, and so forth. So if you have not checked out Ethico, now's the time to do it. We're getting into Q4 here, kind of starting to think about 2026. Amazing to think we're almost at 2026. But yeah, I'm going to throw this up here. So hit the demo button if you're interested. And let's get a massive one more round of applause for Allison Taylor. She just got nominated, long overdue, nominated for the Thinkers 50 Leadership Award. So this is a phenomenal award, a very prestigious award. And Allison has absolutely earned that with her work in our community in multiple ways, not just the book, not just her, her day job at the Stern School at NYU, but also with Ethical Machines and all the talks that she's done. She's really had a massive impact. So really proud of you, Allison. So glad you're back. You're one of my all-time favorite people. Welcome back to the Ethicsverse.
It's such a delight to see you, Nick, and good to see you doing so well.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're talking about beyond good and bad, building good faith ethics programs. We're going to be talking about this fundamental shift from this binary compliance approach to good faith programs that really drive a lot of development inside of our inside of our organization. So I want to just start out with this, Allison. You see a lot. You get around a lot. You see a lot out there. You have an interesting sort of vantage point. When you look at the current state of ethics and compliance programs across organizations in the world, what are some of the patterns that you're starting to see where programs get stuck between, intention and impact? There's so many well-intending people in this space. So many of us want to leave the world better. We want to make our organizations better, but sometimes that intention doesn't actually translate to impact. Where do folks get stuck?
Yeah, so such a great question. It's interesting because I've just been teaching the Exec MBA course, and there are a lot of ethics and compliance experts in that class. And we had such a good discussion about how success is really about, this is not news, but really about kind of deeply understanding the business and being a partner to the business, not being this kind of judgmental, siloed function off to the side. That's been true for a long time. I think we're in this really kind of interesting time, though, where we used to be able to kind of say, broadly speaking, the world was going in the same direction. It was okay kind of internationally to align your various kind of approaches. And now we've got, to a great extent, this kind of divergence of compliance regimes globally. One obvious example would be privacy in the EU versus the US, but we've got stuff going on ESG. We've got very different attitudes to human rights. And so I think one of the kind of prime challenges is if the regulatory environment is becoming more inconsistent, can we pivot to something that is a bit more principles-based and a bit more culture-based? And that, again, has been, the front foot compliance people have for a long time been thinking about the realities of behavioral science and social psychology, interactions with HR, culture, that kind of thing. And I really see the needle moving there. So I suppose, the way things are going is more towards principles and culture. And I think we kind of all know what makes a good fundamental compliance program. You've been talking about it a lot already, There's employee engagement, there's principles, there's speaking up, there's lack of retaliation. So we've got these foundations in place. Everyone kind of agrees on that. The question is what you're going to do to go above and beyond to really integrate into the organization. And that's a much trickier challenge, of course.
Yeah, I think it is tricky. And it's, I like the way you put that. It kind of be a lot more sort of principles based, because as these regimes change, it's kind of a game of like whack-a-mole, or it's a game of like trying to thread all these different needles. And I think a lot of folks get stuck in that. Like, where should the focus be? When we're talking, the overarching, the thing that keeps everybody up at night is my program effective? And so when you're talking to folks, or just from your vantage point, what assumptions do you think about effective programs we might need to challenge as we're thinking about building something, as you said, that's a lot more principles based, or that's a lot more sort of engagement based, or something that feels more authentic to the workforce?
I mean, let me just pick one, which is kind of discussed quite a lot in my book. And that's this idea of zero tolerance, right? I really, really understand why compliance officers have policies and procedures that emphasize, for example, zero tolerance for corruption. But I think one of the unintended consequences of this is that if you have an employee in a very tricky situation, let's say they're in a frontline market, there is a, pressure to pay a bribe, there's some extortion, there's some security risk. if the message coming from compliance officer and head office is, you know, zero tolerance, we're not going to even explore these complexities with you, then I think it has the risk of kind of making the employee feel really alone. And then the consequence of that is that the organization never really understands the commercial pressure its employees under. So I think in general, like, we've got to be careful to not kind of dump the responsibility and blame on the employee, but make it clear that the compliance team is a partner and you should come openly with the kind of challenges, commercial pressures, sales pressures, local conditions that you're facing, so that the business can work through that in a practical way. And so you've got the information and intelligence about the kind of competitive pressures that you're facing. And one of the upsides of that kind of approach is that then you are really kind of getting embedded and understanding, you know, how the business works and how your oversight and kind of operational and commercial pressures interact.
Well, you know, to that point, it's also kind of an acknowledgement of the realities that, again, back to that sort of concept of authenticity. I'm kind of with you on the zero tolerance thing. It's kind of like creating a lie. You know, I mean, you know, we've all been at the community pool, and every community pool has a sign up that says, you know, no running. And then you see kids running and it's like, okay, well, like, that rule must not really be real. What else isn't real? And I get the sort of intention to say, like, well, we want you to speak up and we're not going to tolerate retaliation. But if, you know, I mean, that study from ECI came out, you know, a year or so ago, and it said like over 50% of people who spoke up faced actual retribution. And so the tricky thing about that zero tolerance, you know, standard is that it's never adhered to, partially because retaliation is at some degree like in the eye of the beholder. So whether it's perceived retaliation or actual retaliation, if people think that retaliation is happening, despite this statement that says, you know, we don't tolerate it at all, it creates this sort of inauthenticity gap, and it makes people, you know, at least subconsciously, I think, start to question what else is real and what's not real. And it kind of, I think, kind of creates an implicit headwind on any other initiatives or any other claims that are coming out from, you know, the ethics team.
Yeah, and I think the retaliation question is super, super fascinating. Like, this is, at the end of the day, about power. So I read hundreds of ethics papers from students about ethical dilemmas every year. Many of them talk about speaking up and being retaliated against. And it's often a sort of soft retaliation, you know, right. They kind of then don't get promoted, they get passed over, they get moved to another team. Even more interesting, I have a conversation in class, and these are with business leaders, right? And I give them this scenario of like, would you hire a whistleblower? And what you find is the class is divided 50-50, with some people saying, of course, this is evidence of courage. I would want someone like that speaking up on my team. You know, I would want, you know, these people kind of using their voices. This is exactly the kind of person I'd hire. Then the other side, half of the class is like, this person's going to be a pain. I don't trust them. What if they undermine me? What if they go over my head? Like, I don't really want all the hassle. Maybe they're a difficult person. And so I give them this scenario and then sort of talk about the courage of whistleblowers, just to kind of illustrate. And you see it in the class every time, that a lot of people who are managers, and, you know, I have that reaction as well. Like, am I going to hire this person and they're going to be complaining the whole time? So, you know, right. I think we've got to be careful, because we tend to say, speak up, everything will be great, you know, do the right thing. And perhaps our managers are giving slightly more ambiguous messages about what the kind of tolerance of this really is. Let's put it that way.
Well, and it also kind of deconstructs down to the individual teams. You know, like, a policy can come out at the corporate level, and the follow through I made that up, whether or not that policy is adhered to or that standard is met is really kind of performed at the individual team level. And to your point, that scenario you talked about where the team, or, you know, the classroom is split, well, presumably that's going to probably be true across managers as well. So I think it's a lot more authentic. To your point, it drives a lot more impact when we can, you know, I tell people, assume you have a retaliation problem. Like, how wrong are you going to be? You know, if I was at a conference one time and I asked, raise your hand if you would, you know, tolerate, you know, retaliation. And of course, nobody put their hand up. And it's like, all right, well, half of the people are experiencing some kind of retaliation. So then the level of retaliation in your organization undoubtedly is beyond what you would like, quote unquote, tolerate. So I think it's so much more authentic to not pave over that and not paint this sort of fake, aspirational picture, but rather acknowledge what the realities are for somebody who might be in that kind of a scenario, and also kind of acknowledge what the challenges are for those managers who might be, this wheel, squeaky wheel gets the oil. Also, at some point, I don't want a wheel that keeps squeaking after I've given it the oil, right? Like there's some of that tension.
Yeah, of course. So, I just think it's a kind of, and Edgar Schein, the famous academic, compared culture to an iceberg. So I think what you've also got to be careful about is, as we've kind of been talking about, the explicit message contradicts the kind of signals employers are getting. And another kind of point I'd make from all these ethics papers, they're all about bad leadership. They're all about leaders who act as if the rules don't apply to them. And I think that's another potential problem with this kind of zero tolerance messaging. If you're saying it's zero tolerance messaging, but everyone can see very clearly that there's some tolerance for leaders breaking these kind of norms and policies, or the feeling they need less training and less oversight and they don't need to kind of adhere to the same rules as everybody else, that's pretty toxic for culture. If there's an impression there's one set of rules for you and one set of rules for me, it's only a matter of time before people start fiddling their expenses and timesheets and kind of feeling like this is all really unfair. So that perception of unfairness, I think human beings are so attuned to fairness or unfairness. We're so attuned to picking up on these kind of signals. And so I would rather see a real kind of commitment to the same principles apply to everybody than only you guys have to adhere to these rules. It's fine for me because I'm in power.
Yeah, we have a high perception for unfairness, and we also, it seems wired into my kids at least, a high sensitivity to hypocrisy. And so again, I'm not trying to spend the whole time talking about, anti-retaliation necessarily, but if you're in a national park and they say zero tolerance for littering, well, what are you going to start doing? You're going to start looking for littering. You're going to start looking for debris and balled up cans or kind of smashed cans and stuff like that. And then when you see those, you're like, okay, well, this is a fake commitment. They actually don't care about keeping this, national park clean or whatever. I just think it's so much more effective to talk about, hey, this is a reality in our business. This is a human thing. And whether it's real or not, it's real to you. And if you're feeling it, we want to do something about it because we want to reduce retaliation or we want to stamp that out. I just think it's a way more, it's a way more sort of authentic way to your point from before, address the realities of the business and build that authenticity to where we can be trusted. Like all the gaps inside organizations, all the dead weight loss, just to kind of get Econ 101 on it, all the dead weight loss comes from these mismatched expectations. There's an expectation that somebody performs to this level and they don't put in the effort, or there's an expectation that the company is going to treat everyone the same and then they don't. And that has sort of negative externalities on the expenditure of effort, within the organization ultimately, or the, extent to which sort of policies or, way things are supposed to be done are actually done by people. How do you think we can kind of start address this in some other areas outside of retaliation? Where are some of the other gaps that you see? Is it merely just kind of shining a light on an application of, fair, rules applied to somebody up the chain and really kind of trying to kind of show the antithesis of the hypocrisy that somebody may have seen in their last organization? How do we kind of take some action on, this concept that we're talking about?
I mean, I think kind of signaling accountability is really, really important. And to go back to your kind of parks and litter analogy, which I really love, so much better to see a sign saying, we really want to keep this park clean. We know this is really difficult. We'd appreciate your efforts, help us gather the litter. We're working on this, work with us, rather than zero tolerance. And as you say, then you see all the polystyrene everywhere. And then you're like, these people can't oversee anything. So what you've got to do, I think, is to bring employees along on the journey. Their eyes and ears and voices are actually what you need if you want this embedded into culture. And so, I think that is kind of really, really important. Something that has come up a lot recently for me, and I'm wondering if you're hearing about it, it's a little bit of a kind of different angle, but lots and lots of companies seem to be really, really struggling with the question of what employees are allowed to say and are not allowed to say on social media. And I think that has become, a really big issue in recent weeks. And it is, there's a really good article in Bloomberg recently where Beth Cowett points out that corporations, by trying to police this, are kind of turning themselves into content moderators. And that's a kind of good example of taking on, are you really going to go out there and monitor what every single one of your employees is doing on social media? No, you're not. And so, but at the same time, we've heard of people getting fired one way or the other for doing things where maybe they weren't aware of the rule and they weren't aware of the principle. So it's a good example of maybe you're not going to be out there monitoring every single thing because you don't have the capacity, but you do want to make it clear to an employee, if you work here, here's what you are and aren't allowed to say about our firm, about other things, about political issues. I think kind of given where we are, getting clear on that kind of thing and clear about your expectations is really, really important.
Yeah. Man, it's like the stuff that people used to say at the bar over a beer with their buddies is now said on social, and that's there forever. And a lot of organizations feel like they want to get out ahead of that, and they don't want things to blow up. Like we've seen so much over the last couple of weeks, and frankly over the last couple of years on stuff like this. So
right. And I see someone in the chat mentioning Slack. I mean, I think that's the other thing. Like we've got to sort of speak up. We really want to hear from you. And then a lot of organizations have ended up buried in these kind of horrible political conflicts going on the internet, going on Slack, going on about some, one of the many kind of controversial issues out there. And so it's really hard to walk a line between we want to encourage respectful debate, we want to value different opinions, but where's the line when you're kind of burying the whole organization in really, really unproductive conflict? And I think a lot of people, again, kind of struggling with this line, between free speech and responsibility and respect. There's a wonderful project by the Aspen Institute that I know Allstate Insurance has implemented called the Better Arguments Project. And it teaches employees to kind of debate each other and negotiate respectfully. And given how polarized we are in this country in particular, I think that's the kind of thinking that we need if we're going to get out of some of this kind of divisiveness that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think what you're alluding to right now, this sort of better debate kind of approach, this is not like a far-fetched idea. I mean, growing up, we would have big family dinners, and half of my aunts and uncles were very liberal, the other half were very conservative, and they would be able to debate about Bill Clinton or whoever was in power at that time, and that didn't blow up. So it's not that far away. It's just kind of engaging in a bit of a different way, and really kind of, I think, kind of at its essence, sort of seeking to understand. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but what we're kind of talking about is the ever-changing sort of landscape that our businesses are traversing across, and the ever-changing values and the sort of social pressures that come along with the sort of inevitable conversations that are being had. And then how do we, as ethics and compliance teams, really kind of help de-risk our organization? That's our ever-living mandate. And I think what you're kind of alluding to is a certain flexibility and a certain responsiveness that is required today that maybe was not required in 1992 or whenever compliance teams or compliance programs were kind of first getting formed. How would you kind of advise somebody who's really resonating with what you're saying, who sees that maybe there's a little bit too much rigidity in their program that ends up sort of creating what could be kind of perceived as compliance theater, as opposed to the impact, the good faith sort of approach that you're kind of espousing?
I think part of it is kind of not treating every risk and every procedure in exactly the same way, not thinking you need a rule for everything. If you try and have a rule for everything, then employees will not use their own judgment, their own intelligence, their own thought. They'll be like, oh, there's no rule for that, so I guess I can break the rule. So I think part of it's about kind of proportionality. Part of it's about meaningful risk assessment. Again, and she's quoted very heavily in my book, but Hui Chan, the former kind of DOJ compliance monitor, sort of talking about how what she really wanted to see from compliance officers was a proportionate risk-based approach where the corporations kind of understood the risks it's exposed to, and put in place processes kind of accordingly. One of the examples she gave me is, there was some kind of expenses violation in some company that she was working with, and the organization's response was to give everybody expenses training, even though only about 100 employees actually even had corporate credit cards. So it's a kind of example of, like, you don't need to kind of roll out all these processes in the same way to kind of cover your ass in case you get in trouble with the regulator. This is about a risk-based approach. And the benefit of you taking a risk-based approach is you're encouraging employees to use their human judgment. You're encouraging employees to come to you with their concerns. And you're not trying to kind of create a rule and a process for everything. Because there are a lot of organizations that do have a rule and a process for everything, and they're actually not preventing unethical behavior.
Yeah. So I'm reading this book, or I'm rereading this book that I've alluded to a little bit recently, called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. Have you heard of this book?
Oh, yeah. I've seen her speak, actually. She's amazing. The poker player.
She is amazing. Really cool. But, in the absence of the risk-based approach that you're talking about, Annie Duke was a World Series of poker. She won the bracelet, and the whole book is really about, this is one of those books that you can just read the cover and then you've read the book. But it's all about really thinking in bets. And, a lot of us run our compliance program like if we were playing poker, we're either all in or we're folding. And it's like nobody actually plays poker that way. Like, you're going to crap out extremely quick. That's kind of like rolling out expense training to, 2,000 people when 100 people have credit cards. So I just think having that kind of a mentality with this sort of foundation of, as you said, Allison, having kind of a principle-based, application of this risk-based approach can really help us kind of spend less of our time on like wasted activities. Like if we can have a mentality to like reduce the deadweight loss of ethics and compliance activities in the organization, that's going to help us make sure that more of our time is spent on the things that are actually going to move the needle,
don't create complexity. There's only so many rules that anyone can kind of understand and absorb. It's more important that you have someone coming to you for questions and clarifications, that you've got every single thing, covered, every possible scenario covered. It's, every possible sort of legalistic kind of notion. It's more about protecting you than it is about protecting the organization. So I would rather see fewer rules, more principles, and really kind of, open invitation to come and have a conversation.
Yeah. And I think if those principles are right, I never went to law school, although I kind of think I'm a lawyer in some ways. I'm just kidding. But in getting my CPA, there's like 7 principles of accounting that like I don't know all of the rules, but those principles are pretty good, and they're pretty, you can get like, I can guess probably to 85% like accuracy what the answer should be just by relying on those principles without having to read all the tax code and without having to read all the, the gap pronouncements and stuff like that. And so I think there's a lot of freedom and there's a lot of flexibility in what you're talking about, really trying to boil it down to the first principles or boil it down to the underpinning principles that you want to kind of serve as guides or guideposts for, the behavior in the myriad situations that you can't really articulate. As we try to add, to your point, more complexity, there ends up being this sort of inadvertent sort of signal sent that says like, okay, well then what does the policy say? There must be a policy for everything. There can't be a policy for everything. That's kind of the point.
Right. And, and some employees face more risks than others. Like sales teams face particular risks,
Right.
The money laundering, training maybe doesn't have to be for everybody. It's just for people in certain functions making certain decisions. And so, I think it's also just kind of a case of proportionality. And if you can be more proportional, you'll also reduce the perception that you're a very expensive cost center putting in place endless processes.
Yeah. And I think so much of what, for us to be successful, like I was saying kind of in the start of the show, so much of our success is sort of contingent on not just the sort of circumstances we're creating for compliant behavior, but the extent to which all these individuals who are making, individual decisions on their application of their actions, the extent to which those sort of, again, comply with those lines that we've drawn on the road. And I think when we show up as, idiots, let's just say, to be nice. Let's put it the other way. If we can show up as reasonable, common sense, business people that understand, to your point from before, that understand the business or are seeking to understand the business, and we're trying to account for and accommodate the inevitable flexibility that's necessary for somebody on the front lines, I think it increases our credibility so much, and a lot of the compliance that we're trying to sort of force becomes a lot more sort of natural.
Exactly. No, exactly. And I think, I couldn't really put it better myself, but that kind of, you understand the pressures the business functions are under, you understand kind of timing needs, practical, flexible, kind of reasonable, proportionate, what you lose in kind of, the having a gold-plated rule for everything, you gain in effectiveness, you gain in getting people talking to you, you gain in kind of understanding and preventing retaliation, you gain in being able to hold unethical leaders accountable. All this stuff is super important. And this is so timely, right? There have been so many stories recently about CEOs we're at a 20-year high, by the way, of CEOs being fired for ethical violations. A lot of them have been relating to romantic relationships with people on their team. And so it is turning out in a lot of organizations that's tolerated at the senior leadership level.
Exactly.
Whatever policy might say. So I think it's a kind of perfect opportunity, perfect example of everything that we're talking about. We need the same rules to apply to senior leadership. CEOs arguably should have even less ability to have romantic relationships than everybody else. And then, that kind of lack of accountability, that sort of tolerance of this going on at the board level, the C-suite level, that's proving a huge problem in a lot of organizations in a lot of contexts. And there are at least a few cases where it also tracks with commercial conflicts of interest. So, I think it's a very good example of this sort of scale and nature of the challenge and how we might think about this differently.
Yeah, if the head of the fish stinks, the whole fish stinks. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about this good faith thing. We had some folks from former DOJ on a show recently, and they're going to be coming back for a more in-depth conversation. And the thing I kept sort of seeing over and over again, or the thing I kind of the through line, was really this concept of good faith. And I think you kind of alluded to it in your book to some degree. And I think Hui Chen is a big sort of proponent of this, is like, I'm looking for evidence. Somebody external is looking for evidence of like, are you in practice putting sort of good faith efforts to extinguish risks in a reasonable way? Are you taking some kind of a materiality lens? And are you really trying to push this forward? Or are you just trying to sort of build a paper program and say, hey, well, look, I have a policy for that. They violated the policy, sort of a trying to like stiff arm the responsibility is what it kind of boils down to. What do you think this good faith like effort, or this heart for a good faith approach, like what does that like look like in practice? Maybe, in the context for an employee who is facing real world ethical dilemmas. How do we differentiate and sort of shed the risk of, conveying, whether internally or externally, this risk of compliance theater?
I think the thing is, where are you asking employees to go with their ethical dilemmas? Are you giving them a channel to talk? Are you giving them a forum is it clear where they can go if they have problems with their manager, or they're facing some, pressure to break a rule and they feel that there is, a low likelihood of getting caught? So I think it's partly about, being politically savvy and approachable. It's partly about having good relationships with managers and leaders across the business. It's partly about kind of accountability and incentives for those leaders. Something that can really be done, though I'm not saying it's easy, is, are you being rewarded not just for whether you achieve the results, but how you achieve the results? Are we tolerating managers that take credit for the people working in their teams? I really do think that the kind of tone at the top and tone at the middle, and how you are interacting with your senior leadership team or your senior leadership group, or even your middle managers, because those are the people in front of mainstream employees. So the messages that they're giving about their relationships with the compliance, their relationships with principals,
right,
what is going on there is where the rubber hits the road. So I think, I think having really kind of honest, good faith discussions with, at senior leadership meetings, really trying to kind of build out that dialogue is a really good first step. But none of this is easy, and I would say it's also getting much, much, much harder.
But also, nothing that's easy is really that fun. You know what I'm saying? Anything that's fun is kind of hard. So this is that's why I think this whole space is so fun, because it's kind of a puzzle, and we have to balance these regulatory issues and the constraints on our resources and the personalities and all those kinds of things. It's easy to frame that as like overwhelming and it's so difficult. I'm not saying you're doing that, but I think sometimes we inadvertently do that. When the name of the game is not perfection, to your point, we can't like achieve that. The name of the game is progress. The name of the game is improvement. And I think, back to the start of this conversation, there's everybody that I meet at conferences, everybody that I meet on a demo or on a discovery call, or everybody I meet who's like in this space, we really do want to leave the world better. There's so much good intention in the space. And I think our desire, like, I feel like, good faith is sort of it's almost table stakes. And I think just merely, so then the game becomes like, how do we translate that in our actions so that the good faith approach that is kind of wired into all of us is actually perceived throughout the organization, or can be sort of evidenced by someone, coming in from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's such a good point. Like, I don't think anybody gets into ethics and compliance because they want to write a load. I mean, maybe some people do, but they want to write a load of rules and policies and interact with the legal team. They get into this because they really want to make our organizations better. They really care about people. They really care about these kind of principles and conduct and making the world better and making our businesses better. And so can we just recenter that? Can we recenter that and kind of get away from the kind of rules-based approach, not least because the rules-based approach is becoming more ineffective every day. One, the number of rules and the differences in rules are overwhelming. And then two, in some cases, there's backsliding on rules. And so we need to kind of elevate, I think, this whole profession to maybe, both ethics and compliance are important, but I'd rather see the needle shift a little bit more to ethics and away from compliance.
Well, I mean, the principles live in that ethical side of the house, to your point. The compliance, to the extent that there is sort of a differentiation between these different sides of the house, is really sort of the application of these principles in a particular situation or in a particular procedure. And I think when we can overly focus on that ethical side, I think it makes the compliance side a lot easier. It's a lot easier to communicate, because I think we all kind of have, you said it before, like, we're all wired for fairness. Human beings are. My children are, immediately as they could talk, it seems like, my daughter's first words to each other were like, "That's not fair." Okay. I didn't teach them that. They just can kind of feel that. And so I think when we can root down into that ethical thing, and we can frame out our values or frame out a policy or whatever into some kind of an overarching value that can resonate at that heart level, it can give people some clues on what they need to do in the gray. Because to your point from before, we live in the gray and we can't articulate every single scenario that somebody might come in contact with, Yeah.
And let's just also say, like, everybody has values that they hold really deeply. Those values might not be the same. Our politics are not the same. Our worldviews are not the same. Our cultures are not the same. But every single human being in the world has values that they take very, very seriously. And so that's a powerful force. That's a powerful motivator. And I think if you sort of disregard the importance of values and sort of, express that rules are more important, you're switching off something so motivating and so inspiring that's kind of in all of us. So it's, I think, getting with that mess and getting with the gray and understanding how you can kind of really motivate your workforce to be on your side and to be out there kind of helping to make our businesses better.
So I want to kind of take this question in a little bit of a different angle, the question I'm about to ask. So we're kind of talking about policies at some level. I kind of want to move to this sort of evidence-based program architecture and moving beyond just sort of policies and training. And, we kind of touched on it a little bit sort of at a macro level, which at its essence, your answer is really kind of an application of sort of behavioral science principles at some degree. rooting down into people's individual values. I want to take this like a layer deeper. How do you think we can start to apply that on a department by department basis? There are different departments in all of our organizations, and the clustering of people in those those different departments sometimes have a different sort of prioritization of values. Maybe somebody in quality control, they're really valuing process adherence and, things going right, whereas somebody in sales is really about competition and something like that. How do you think we can kind of start to think through what sort of those clusterings of values might be within our own organization, and apply some of these sort of behavioral science principles so that we're not treating every single department the same?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is measure and assess your culture. That's one thing, and you can think about how measuring when and how these different teams speak up and on what basis. Some level of tension between, let's say, an operational risk, a quality control team and a sales team is appropriate. Like, we need people to hold those different things and hold them accountable. The problem comes if we are kind of disempowering one particular team and not the other. So I think you need to understand how people feel about their jobs, how people feel about their leadership. Do people feel that their advice is being taken seriously? Or if someone in quality control pops up with a giant issue at the last minute and it's going to really screw up your commercial results, is the answer that person gets retaliated against and fired? So I think measurement at the team level is really, really important. I've done a lot of work over many, many years, that demonstrates that if your company is heading for an ethics scandal, it will show up in the culture and will show up in how people feel about their leaders and about their jobs and about their roles and about incentives way before the problem really kind of manifests. And so that's an early warning system. And I think, again, like, there's a bit of a risk that something like measuring culture sounds soft and fluffy, and having a policy sounds hard and rigorous, and the regulator will be pleased. But I think, most regulators want to see these proportionate good faith efforts. So I've done some really interesting work measuring culture. I did some work for Novartis, looking at what it took to get employees to usefully speak up. We looked at tenure, we looked at where they were speaking, we looked at how, and what we found was, and for an employee to speak up, they need to trust their manager, but they also need to, see if they see only good things, they might become complacent. If they see only bad behavior around, they'll kind of give up and check out. So you want to, you want people who are kind of, seeing this mix of good and bad and feeling empowered to do something about it.
Yeah, because to your point, there is like, what business isn't a mix of good and bad? There's a bunch of stuff that goes well. There's a bunch of stuff that like doesn't go according to plan. And there's this sort of desire to put up this bella figura, or this sort of facade that overly focuses. We did it. Look how great everything is. And it's like, to your point, we have to show that good and bad, because that does end up empowering people to speak up about things. And we have to shine a light on the bad, because there's a lot of lessons to be learned from them. I think the worst thing we can do is sort of bury those things. I think, though, a lot of folks, especially in ethics and compliance, we struggle with, how do we show that? How do we show that without it? All right, what would you say to this? If somebody is like fearful of showing, things that have gone wrong because they think that's going to be a reflection on their failure as a compliance person, like shining a light, I think this is like a misnomer sometimes, but like shining a light on, non-compliant behavior, let's just call it for shorthand. If I think that that's an indication that I'm not doing my job well, might that prevent me from creating the full picture of the gray, of the good and bad, that ends up empowering people to, participate in this risk management apparatus? Like, what would you tell somebody who's kind of thinking that way?
I think you need to demonstrate that there is accountability. If you're just kind of investigating and kind of quietly doing stuff in the background and no one's really aware that when rules are violated and that problems occur, people are being held accountable, then you won't, that's really important. There needs to be accountability for bad behavior, and that needs to be communicated. So you can share real life examples of cases you've investigated and resolved. You can kind of provide guidance. You should certainly use your real life investigative experiences to, for example, design really dynamic interactive training. So that, I think there's kind of an element of that there. And then I think it's about kind of not oversimplifying stuff that's really complicated and stuff that's really human. We talked earlier about zero tolerance maybe for something like corruption and bribery, which is really difficult in some markets where there's a lot of facilitation payments and a lot of extortion. And we've also talked about having affairs and sexual harassment, but that's another really good example of where it's gray. Like if you're firing people for making a single inappropriate comment and you're not giving them the time to course correct, and you're not, they may have had good intentions, they may have said the wrong thing, romance and all that stuff is a really, really tricky topic. It's really, really tricky in the workforce. So if you're having the same approach to someone that's, making a sustainedly harassing someone in their team, and you've got the same approach to someone that made a single inappropriate comment that they deeply regret, you're not really doing anything to tackle that issue. You're treating treating the same thing, a spectrum of behavior with a sort of single hammer. So, I think that's a kind of really good example of where it's more important to kind of have a discussion and try and resolve it and have, make it clear that these things are complex and you can't have a rule for everything and sort of say zero tolerance for this and we're firing you no matter what, which makes people feel really paranoid. And it's not necessarily going to stop the behavior.
Yeah, and I think we did. Look, to the extent that an organization's ability to outperform or generate more enterprise value is a function of the extent to which all the people in the organization are expending sort of effort beyond the level below which they would get fired, then we need to not create circumstances that are going to reinforce this self-preservation muscle that is in everybody. If everybody is so scared of getting fired, to your point, or if every foot fault is going to get you kind of electrocuted, then that's going to cause people to, at the margin, not expend that extra effort. I think we want to create clear lines on the road so that somebody can really put the foot on the gas and have some clarity on where the road ends and so forth, but not be driving so nervously that they end up going slower. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. If you have, the example is German autobahns, right? You've got really, really clear rules of the road so people can go faster and get things done more efficiently. I think you kind of put it perfectly.
Okay, very good. See, that's all I was really looking for, Allison. Okay. So you've done a lot of this interesting work. Wendy mentioned that sometimes some of this culture measurement is a mixed bag. It's something that's kind of amorphous and something that's kind of hard to measure. How do we I want to kind of balance that against sort of a good faith effort to we'll try to investigate it, regardless of the amorphous nature of it. What are some data points that you think we can be collecting and looking at that maybe people typically aren't? And how do you think we can get enough confidence from whatever we should be looking at to start to experiment or change some of our program design?
Measurement's really difficult in compliance, and you can see it from disclosures. People, talk about policies. People talk about how many investigations they've done. People talk about the use of the speak up line. Is a lot of investigations a good sign that you've got a really active compliance team, or is it a bad sign that you've got a lot of violations? Is a lot of whistleblowing reports a good sign because people feel able to speak up, or is it a sign that you've got a lot of problems? You could spin it either way. So I think we look at and disclose the data that's objective and easy to gather and not necessarily most useful. So, I think we need to kind of work on measurement and work on what we're looking at and work on what we're, what we're thinking about. And so there I go to kind of culture and how people are feeling about their roles. And let's just say it's ethical culture we need to measure, not necessarily an employee engagement survey, which employees don't necessarily believe is really confidential and is maybe designed to kind of say, here's my employee engagement score. So, so there's all of, I think all of that kind of going on. I think that there's just a lot of work to kind of understand whether people feel comfortable and whether people really feel like they want to be in this company and be in this job. It's a really interesting article that kind of went viral recently showing that a lot of young people are doing side gigs, they're doing their day job, they're sitting in your company, and they're kind of trying to run a startup on the side. So that is not a good sign that people feel trusted and motivated and so on. And I would also say that, out there've been a lot of layoffs. There's a lot of talk about, AI taking away everybody's jobs. I think a lot of people feel really concerned about their jobs and concerned about longevity, and therefore don't feel very loyal to their companies. And so I think showing that you really care about and are people first and believe in your people is right now in 2025 a significant source of competitive advantage.
I think you're exactly right. And I think there's a big opportunity. I mean, think about any close relationship that you have with anybody in your life, just on a person-to-person basis. You have a voice with that person. That person understands you. And I think for some reason in the corporate world, we kind of forget that, it's not actually just a bunch of labor units, working for utils. It's a bunch of human beings who are putting their time and their effort in pursuit of the organization's mission. And I think applying some of that, maybe this is just kind of back to the behavioral science point you were making from before, but applying some of that, those kind of principles or those kind of foundational elements that exist in any sort of regular interpersonal relationship to an employee base gives us a lot of opportunity to uncover things and make people feel like their voice is heard. I don't think anyone's going to be, no one's going to love your company if your employees don't love your company. And if we as ethics and compliance can help our organization get more sort of employee love, it's just going to translate into goodness. The harvest will inevitably be a lot bigger. And, I'm just trying to think about, there's people on this call who are on this episode who are working at 100,000 person organizations, and there's people who are working at a couple hundred person organizations. The principles that we're talking about span all organization sizes. And so how can somebody who maybe doesn't have budget to do a big, culture survey and bring some sort of consultants in, or they don't have money to spin up a stay interview kind of program, what kind of things could they start doing to get some data points, whether quantitative or qualitative, to start maybe directing their efforts, to maybe think in some bets to a greater degree and start maybe experimenting on how to change their program a bit?
I think in a smaller organization, you'll have a lot more personal relationships. And then, the really key point is that the leader is modeling the kind of behavior that gets rewarded, and everyone will see that in a small organization. So
Great.
I would really put my attention in a smaller organization on the behavior the senior leadership team is modeling, the signals the leadership team is giving about what is rewarded, what it takes to be successful around here. In a 100,000 person organization, the vast majority of employees are not going to have direct contact with the senior leadership team on a daily basis. So it is, it's still going to be important what behavior they're modeling, but of course you need more kind of structure and process and direction, especially at the middle management level in that larger organization. So I think it's also about what is the growth stage of your company? To what degree can you rely on leadership to kind of model behavior and that will be seen? And to what degree are you thinking about, your global presence, different cultures, and what kind of processes and approaches you're going to have in place so that you can be consistent wherever anyone is working in the world.
So as you were thinking, or as you were saying that, I think, what you're kind of talking about is sort of McDonaldizing via sort of process the way the employee experience should be across a bunch of different managers who you might not have sort of direct influence over on a day-to-day basis or whatever. I mean, you can go to, Chick-fil-A is famous for its great service, and they've sort of quote unquote McDonaldized this thing across all these different locations where the service level is relatively higher than most other fast food chains because they kind of deconstructed what that service provision sort of should look like, and they've kind of put some policies around it. We rolled out
a good example,
Costco's a great example.
Principles, and I think the first one is obey the law, and they've got these. Not only have they got these principles, they've got a hierarchy of priorities. So it's pretty clear to everyone. If you work at Costco, these are the principles we're applying. There are a lot of other firms, and I can name them, but I won't, that have a bunch of principles that all kind of could contradict each other in certain circumstances, and they're not making it clear what the priority is going to be in an ambiguous or ambivalent situation. So I think Costco does a really, really good job of this. And then, like, let me just give you an example, and it's from sustainability. So it's from a very, very different field. We've been talking a lot, and I can see a lot of discourse in the chat about kind of when was the last time you heard a leader admit to failure or say they don't know or kind of take responsibility for anything. There's an Australian tech company called Atlassian. And I work not just in compliance, I also work in sustainability. And there is a tendency in both compliance and sustainability to say, here are all the wonderful things we're doing. Here are all the things we investigated. Here are all our commitments. Here's what we've achieved. Here's what we're doing about climate change. And the problem is that the general public's very skeptical. If you read Atlassian's sustainability report on the first page in really, really plain language, they say, here's what we achieved last year. Here's what we didn't achieve and where we failed on our goals and why. And here is where we're going next year. And the effect of this on the reader is that you then believe everything else in the report. You've seen this kind of willingness to say, we didn't get everything right. Here's why we failed. Something else came up in the business. There were other priorities. We were overstretched. And it has this incredible effect if you read it, that you're then like, what this company says is trustworthy. This company is not being like, we got everything perfect. Look at all the wonderful things we're doing. And so it's this kind of paradox. I think people feel that admitting to imperfection, that authenticity is this incredibly risky thing. Like people are going to come after you on social media, like the regulator's going to come after you. Whereas in fact, I think we're in this situation where everyone is so exhausted with the hypocrisy and greenwashing and the compliance theater that you actually get further by saying, we're really struggling with measuring this. We're working on trying to understand and hold our leaders accountable. This is kind of difficult. Here's what we're doing. And I kind of think that is so much more credible than what I tend to see out there.
So you're not that big on tooting your own horn, so let me toot your horn for you. When ESG was coming out, you were like the lone voice screaming in the this is from, World According to Nick. You were the lone voice screaming in the wilderness saying, listen, this has the chance to really kind of go off the rails. And this has the chance to really turn into, a bunch of sort of greenwashing, a bunch of sort of ethics washing, whatever you want to call it. And instead of saying, look at all these great things that, we're doing and blah, 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 really focus on a couple of things that you can actually authentically do. I've said this 1,000 times. People that think I'm smart, I'm just stealing your words. But I'm just trying to tell everybody on the call here, you just really gave us a lot of gold. There was you talked about the Costco, not only principle-based, but then that prioritization. And providing some of that prioritization is really kind of creating a decision-making algorithm for all the myriad situations in the grade that you can't you can't anticipate, you can't sort of litigate, or you can't sort of, list out on a page. That's something that any of us, regardless of organization size, can really start to kind of think through and start to kind of provide that sort of guidance that builds credibility, that actually will add value to the organization. And the other thing you talked about, and again, this is sort of a through line throughout this entire conversation, is this, focus on authenticity. Sharing what didn't go right I think resonates with all of us, because all of us are human beings who are living life where stuff goes wrong all the time, right? The best laid plans of mice and men always go awry in my book. So like talking about that builds so much credibility, it builds so much authenticity, and it really sort of starts to shed away the sort of compliance theater risk. So these are things that I think we should be doing on a daily basis.
Let me kind of close with a sort of, what I hear from my Gen Z students, and they're like, so don't respect authority, or kind of don't even know what it is, want to be mentored. They're kind of like, what are you going to do for me? I feel like the idiots at the top are getting it wrong. And so the more like rules and compliance theater you have up there, the more people are checking out and kind of not believing you. So you got to make it their problem. Like if they're so smart and they think they can solve all these problems, like go to them and say, this is really challenging. How are we going to measure ethical leadership here? Like, and get everybody like involved in solving these really difficult questions, rather than like pretending you've got it sewn up and then no one believes you, no one thinks you're authentic, and everyone checks out. So like, if people are complaining and bitching and thinking that you've got things wrong, make it their problem. Say, you help me solve this. That's what I think we should be doing.
Yeah. I mean, so many of us are doing compliance programs like those old ads that our grandparents used to watch, when there was 3 television shows and it would be a doctor smoking a cigarette and saying, Lucky Strikes are the best cigarette. It's like, that doesn't work anymore. I think the authenticity, to your point, then makes it just stacks the deck in our favor. It makes it more likely that people are going to actually get involved, the people who we need to get involved, as opposed to making these claims that people are going to sit back. Like, the more claims you make without that sort of showing that downside, the more claims you make, the people are going to be like, prove it. And I think there's a massive opportunity in this Gen Z generation that if we're not careful, it's going to slip through our fingertips, and the next 10 years are going to look just like the last 15 years,
Exactly. And I think, the other thing to recognize is there are things like measurement of effectiveness. No one's nailed this. No one's got this right. So rather than all kind of pretending that we've nailed it and disclosing the number of investigations and the number of whistleblowing calls, and like we're like the drunks looking, measuring, looking for our car keys under the street light because that's where the light is. Let's just admit that measurement's a real challenge. Let's just admit that regulatory inconsistency is a real challenge. Let's get these dilemmas on the table and let's chew on them and let's kind of collectively try and solve them. I think that would be good.
Yeah, that would be good, and that would be fun. All right, man, this was awesome. I told you guys this was going to be awesome. If you've never met Allison or you've never seen her around, this is just the tip of the iceberg, okay? So let's get a massive emoji explosion. One more round of applause for the one and only Allison Taylor. If you have not bought her book and you did not win a book, go buy it today. I can't say enough good things about it and about you, Allison. Thank you so much for joining us on the Ethicsverse.
Oh, it's just such a joy to talk to you, Nick. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll see you soon. See you guys next week. We got a great one next week. I guarantee it. Bye-bye.
Bye.